Welcome everyone to my session as part of the Experimentation conference. My session is called Bridging the Discovery Validation Gap or Avoiding a Waste Producing Machine. My name is Ellie. I've been in the industry for about 10 years and I've been helping businesses to ship experiments at scale and create more value from their experimentation program. Last year, I won the Agency Experimenter of the Year Award and Financial Services Campaign of the Year at the Experimentation Elite Awards, and I was shortlisted for the finals of the Experimentation Culture Awards. So on to what we're going to talk about today. I love this quote from Reid Hoffman, the founder of LinkedIn. If you're not embarrassed by the first version of your product, you've launched too late. And I think this is a really good way of trying to say, actually, don't spend too long discovering, don't spend too long validating, get things in front of customers, but actually getting the right trade-off between the amount that you're discovering and the amount that you're validating. And I think it's a really nice way of expressing that sentiment, particularly if you're launching a new product from scratch. So part one, this is going to be a little bit theoretical, but just a quick primer on what we mean by discovery and validation techniques. This might be nothing new to some of you, but there'll be people maybe watching this content who've not gone into these topics in as much detail before. So discovery theory. So product discovery has been around for a while. It's been around since the 90s when companies started thinking a bit more time about how they could actually deploy products in a more thoughtful way. When you think back, you know, it was full waterfall era. You had really big projects. It would take ages to convince people to spend the money to build the project, to then release it to customers, and then actually maybe the project wasn't that great, and so they weren't actually spending enough time listening to customers, and actually that led to a lot of waste. So very expensive failures or products making it to release before their creators realized that people just didn't actually need them. So actually building things that just weren't needed, really. And a quick theory note here, if you want to learn a bit more about discovery, there's the Maze product discovery course. There's loads of product discovery courses out there, to be honest. But also the Teresa Torres content on Product Talk is also excellent. So definitely go and check that out. But a quick definition here is the process of closely understanding what your users' problems and needs are, then validating your ideas for solutions before starting development. We typically define product discovery in contrast with product delivery. Product discovery is used to describe the work that we do to make decisions about what to build, while delivery is the work we do to build, ship, and maintain a production quality product. And I think the Teresa Torres one gives it the kind of breadth of definition there. It includes lots of activities that lead you to decide what you want to build. Some examples of discovery techniques. So some of these are pre-launch, some of these can be used post-launch. Quite a lot of them you might want to use before you launch your product for the first time. So user research, including exploratory, generative, market research, competitor research, user interviews and customer councils, market research, user testing, usability, things like diary studies. So these are all the kind of qualitative techniques. And then within the quantitative group, you've got things like product analytics, heat mapping, session recordings, incoming feedback, that sort of thing. Part of the frameworks, you know, there's quite a lot of frameworks in this space. So design thinking and design sprints, using sort of lean UX and build, measure, learn, the value canvas, the lean canvas, using jobs to be done. Lots and lots of frameworks in this space that help you get to the root of a customer problem and then try and come up with things that you might want to do off the back of the customer problem that you've found. And there's some interesting materials here on the right. So the Maze Guide to Product Discovery, if you want to go a bit deeper, there's a nice list from Craig Sullivan of lots of design thinking articles. This is a really good video from someone I used to work with called Sally Foote, who did this amazing analysis of doing qualitative product testing with physical products. So actually working on a factory line and testing out how a product physically works before sending it to customers. So that's kind of a high level of what discovery is. In terms of what it isn't, it won't tell you how to build a feature, product or service over an equivalent method. So it won't tell you that one validation technique for finding out a piece of information is better than another. It will tell you the customer problem, but it won't tell you how necessarily to solve that customer problem if you've got two equivalent methods. It can predict the size of the prize, but not measure the actual returns on a not yet developed idea. It's necessary for generating ideas, evidence, and lines of inquiry. It does not include deciding what to build in what order necessarily, when to build it and how to deliver it, i.e. creating a roadmap and strategy. but it will tell you if those things were wrong or if you don't have your priorities set correctly for your chosen outcome. So it's kind of like that trade-off between the product manager's job, which is setting that roadmap and strategy and OKRs and vision, and then actually using discovery to help you get closer to what you're trying to achieve.
Hi, this is Romo Santiago from Experimentation. If you'd like to connect with hundreds of experimenters from around the world, consider joining our Slack channel. You can find the link in the description. Now back to the episode.
So a quick primer on validation. Obviously, the oldest and quickest form of validation in the world is just to launch something, but I wouldn't recommend it. But it's surprising the number of people who use validation techniques incorrectly or simply just use them to validate something they've already built. Do any of these sound familiar? It sounds like a feature factory to me. The product teams build the product and ship it. Then our user researcher does some late stage validation during or after launch. And we have another team who might run some A/B tests to optimize the experience further. Yeah, we do some A/B testing, but it's not a core capability we expect our product teams to have. We should ship the core of the product value first, then optimize it with some small tests later. That's quite a common one. We did some prototypes and wrote a user research report about 6 months ago, but haven't done any user testing with the live site recently. We measured each metric before and after launch, and that was enough. So if you've heard any of these in the product teams that you're working in, this is a sign that you've not got your balance between discovery and validation quite right, that there's a little bit of both going on in there, but actually it's not maybe being embraced in the product team as much as it could be. And some thoughts on sort of really good validation techniques. This is a great article from Itamar Galad and diagram on the right here, but talking about qualitative and quantitative ways that you can roll things out. I like the diagram because it allows you to kind of move from left to right, where on the left, you're talking to stakeholders, you're doing assumption mapping, you're doing business modeling, you're aligning with your goals, you're doing prioritization with ICE, you're moving into fact finding where you're doing data analysis, your product analytics, your user surveys, your hotjar, your heat mapping, some of your qualitative techniques. You move into the middle where you're doing tests, which is a combination of qualitative and quantitative techniques. So rolling out an alpha or a beta, doing usability testing, doing smoke tests. Then on the far right, you've got your experiments like holdback groups, percentage launches, multivariate tests, and A/B tests. So there's a whole plethora of different things in here. Fish food and dog food are basically like an internal beta where you get your internal teams just to test something and use it for themselves before you roll it out to everybody. And then much like discovery, we've described what validation is, but what is it not? So it's not creating the final version of your product or service, but it's rolling out a solution iteratively to customers in a risk-free way. It's not a static list of methods. So the list I just provided on the previous page, a year from now, there might be more techniques than that. Some of these techniques might have gone out of fashion and nobody uses them anymore. So it's always worth keeping up to date with what the current list of, well, not current list, but current available methods for testing things is. It's not a strategy or roadmap, but it is complementary with agile and post-agile frameworks for delivering products like experiment-driven development. Not all things found in discovery can be validated, and not all things found during validation could have been predicted by even the best discovery. And that's a really key learning there. Sometimes you find things out when you roll it out in validation phase that you just couldn't have found even if you'd done the very best discovery in advance. And I think that's a really key learning when you're trying to understand discovery and validation a bit better. So talking about the discovery validation gap. The challenge is really finding customer problems, finding the right customer problems, and actually knowing that you found a real customer problem. And what I like to think about is the quadrant of sort of awareness and knowledge. You know, we all know the things that we do know in the top right about our product. And a lot of us know the things in the top left. We know the things that we don't know. But I think across the bottom where we're doing exploration and unknown knowns, it's really easy to find out more about the things we already know are a customer problem. But what about finding things that are unknown that we don't know about yet? How do we get into that exploration space and start to find out more? So as an example of kind of looking for known problems, if it's already known and observed, we can start with a direct line of inquiry. You've already got an idea in your head of what you might go and do. I'm going to look in Google Analytics and I'm going to find this. And that might come from specific business objectives or senior leadership. Imagine you're a B2B SaaS product and you have a really terrible login experience or customers can't log in. That's a known customer problem that you kind of need to fix before customers can even use the rest of your product. we can start formulating hypotheses easily in this space because we can kind of think about what might make the customer more successful at doing the job we want them to do with our product. But when it's an unknown problem, there will be customer problems out there that we just don't know about yet. It's possible that we just haven't found enough evidence for them, or we just haven't fixed something else that's wrong with the user interface that's so overriding the friction points for the customer that this smaller unknown problem just hasn't been found yet or seen. And so in this case, we need to proceed without a fixed line of inquiry and go really broad in our approach to data evidence and collection, and actually make that discovery much more holistic and include lots of different types of customer evidence in order to find these deeper unknown problems. And then obviously, I'm sure people are familiar with the double diamond, but the theory of discovery versus validation. So in your first part of the double diamond, discovery, where you're broadening, you're allowing lots of data in, you're bringing in lots of information. Then you start to narrow in on the information that's relevant and actually find out like what the core of the customer problem is that you're trying to solve. Then in validation, you're broadening out again because there are lots of different ways you could solve that problem for customers. There are different validation techniques. There are different ways you could roll out exactly a perfect solution, and you've got two different solutions between the two to choose from, and you need to pick. So once again, you need to start narrowing in on a particular solution that you're going to roll out to customers. But two concepts that people almost never talk about when they're talking about discovery and validation is risk. So our appetite and for risk, and our risk versus reward profile for a given product or feature, our tolerance for risk. So how risky are we happy to be when we're actually rolling something out? And it's a really serious consideration when the kind of top-down steer in your business is very risk averse and you're trying to do something that's a bit more risky. How do you align that with your stakeholders, etc.? And then the other thing that we don't talk about a lot is the real production costs of actually shipping products, maintaining them, sustaining spaghetti code, or storage and hosting. And in this instance, it's all about not rolling out the wrong thing that you then have to maintain and keep going and store and host and actually keep adding features to, even though you shipped the wrong thing in the first place. So in the first scenario for teams who just launched, they go straight from having an idea to launching to everyone. So they don't really go through a full discovery and validation process. They kind of have an idea and then they launch it. And there's no real discovery or validation process built in other than that just launch mentality. And in this instance, what happens is every release, every time you launch a feature, it feels like a one-way door. You're putting you're putting a feature out, you're putting a product out, and you don't really feel like you can roll it back. And because it feels so risky, you end up with these big releases that have got lots of features and tickets in. And if you had to roll back the release, you'd have to roll back 100 tickets. And it feels very, very risky. And actually, in this scenario, you're getting some of the benefits of launching. You perhaps haven't chosen the best idea that you would have done if you'd done some discovery. And so your potential reward isn't as good. But you're also being met with all of the risk. So as you can see, this is like the horizontal bar is releases over time. Some of them are positive, some of them are negative, but you're not mitigating the risk of some of those riskier ones. And so actually, you really feel like you can't reverse what you've done, and it's, not an ideal scenario. The reality for teams who do some pre-launch discovery, so they actually do go through the process of doing some research, doing an alpha beta, they get a small group of users to whom they've tested and released the content and they're delivering it to them. It's not with everyone yet, so their discovery validation gap is a little bit smaller, but they've managed to get a bit further along the process. And so you can see here, because the team had done discovery, they've upped their ability to have reward. So each time that they're releasing a positive thing that's making the customers happier, that's improving the customer experience, they're getting all the benefit, nearly all the benefit of the reward. But they're still not mitigating the risk. It might be less risky because they've chosen a genuine customer problem to solve, but they're still rolling it straight out. They're not actually choosing a validation technique to help them roll out the content to customers. But when you get into scenario 3, where people do both pre-launch discovery and they validate during and post-launch, this gives you the fullest opportunity to de-risk your releases, to roll back features that are terrible and customers actually turned out to hate, but also you can measure how much people love or hate the experience that you've rolled out before you roll it out to absolutely everybody. And so in this instance, you've boosted the reward for every single time you do something positive, and you've also reduced the risk massively, because each time you roll something out, you know you can reverse it, and you're also learning each time that you roll it out as well. And everything now feels like a much more flexible two-way door. There are still releases that are always going to be a one-way door, like if you are replatforming your entire site, or you're adding a new authentication system that has to be rolled out, or there's new legal requirements that have to be met, or policies that you have to meet. Those will always be a bit more one-way door-like, but for just normal day-to-day, you know, sprint by sprint releases, everything starts to feel a bit more like a two-way door. And this kind of process of doing discovery and validation is more baked into your delivery process. And actually, there's some ways of thinking about this where people always ask me, like, how much discovery is too much? How much discovery is enough? And I like to talk to them about this scale, which is where on the far left, you've got techniques which tell you about the quality or the why of what customers are doing, but they don't tell you at volume what customers are doing, and they don't give you the deeper segments that you might be missing out on if you rolled it out to thousands of users. On the far right, you've got higher volume techniques which tell you a little bit more about what users are doing at scale, but it's not telling you about why. And what I like to ask product managers to do is to kind of navigate this curve depending on your comfort level. So it's about how much you feel comfortable with the technique you've chosen to validate your idea. If you're really experienced, you have really strong stakeholder relationships, your tolerance for risk is really low, maybe you might do a little bit of user testing with just a few users, maybe run a survey, because you're like, I feel really confident in this idea because I've been testing in this vein for months now, and I know that this is a successful idea. I'm just trying to improve what customers are getting out of it and why. Whereas actually, if something's a little bit more risky, you might choose to do a beta group, or to do a small rollout, or to do some sort of landing page or smoke test, because you're not quite sure. You don't have enough information. And I actually think it's all about cross-validation as well. So if you did some user testing, why not cross-validate with an A/B test as well? So you've actually got a quantitative technique as well as a qualitative technique. And it's not my job to tell the product team which one of these to choose. It's up to them to accept the risk for them in terms of having enough evidence to support your idea. But what I'm always here to do is try and support product teams deploying with more evidence, like choosing to do things based on more evidence. So it's completely up to the PM how they, or the product team, sorry, how they choose to navigate that curve. So in terms of avoiding a waste-producing machine, there's a few steps involved, 6 according to this list. Follow a proven discovery and ideation process. Stop when you have enough customer problems and start working on the most urgent one. Prioritize problems and ideas correctly and quickly, and move on to validating. Avoid validating for the sake of it, and when you do, iterate it in a smarter way. And then finally, incorporate an experiment mindset into your product delivery process, into your engineering process. So when you follow a proven discovery and ideation process, start with the data and customer insight, frame up your customer problems, and then create robust testing backlogs with one backlog per customer problem, so that you can start testing in a particular vein. And then if that vein isn't successful, you're not getting the results that you're looking for, you can pivot away to a different vein. You can start pivoting towards a different customer problem with confidence and going, we're not solving this problem, or we just haven't found the right way of solving it yet. Stop when you've got enough customer problems. This is an example from a client I was working with recently, where we found 6, but there were more than 6. And within each of these 6 customer problem areas, there were maybe 6 to 10 sub problems that we'd identified. These are just the themed up 6 problems that we found. And actually, I would even counsel fewer, because this particular person needed like a complete view, but I actually would recommend that they only pick 2 or 3 and really dive deep into what they're doing. And then in terms of prioritization, it's all about overcoming some sort of some myths that I think exist around prioritization. So one of those is collecting more ideas. So there's a real misconception, particularly in the last few years, of people collecting really large numbers of idea backlogs, hundreds and hundreds of ideas in a Google Sheet, trying to pick all possible ones and then prioritize and execute. And the truth is, you're never going to deliver all of them. Your priorities are going to change in the next week, the next month or quarter or year. And every time you collect new evidence, your backlog is going to be out of date. So the solution is that you cannot have all ideas on your list before you start working on the first idea. And you need to continuously collect data to support new ideas. And some people call this continuous discovery, but it is just literally continuously reading the data coming in, looking to see if anything's changed, looking for new, fresh customer problems that have been revealed by what you've been doing with your product. And Itamar Galad has a nice quote in this space: our level of investment in the idea should always stay proportional to our level of confidence in it. And he's got this nice confidence scale that he uses. And definitely if you're at the self-conviction or crafted pitch end of the scale versus early launch data versus late launch data, you're going to be a lot less confident than you would if you had test results launch data. Prioritization myth number 2, that you should deliver more things. The misconception here is that I deliver the more value and with my work and my product if I deliver more things. And the truth is that number of experiments or number of features delivered just doesn't directly translate into value for the business or the customer. And the solution really is to accept that it's okay to deliver less stuff if that stuff is genuinely valuable to the customer. So you can see on the right here an example from a chap called Sam Weaver called the feature fallacy, where he sort of hypothesizes that the more features you add to the user interface, productivity goes up to a certain point, and eventually productivity starts to go down because you're introducing too many features, too much decision paralysis, too many things for the customer to try and do, and it's interfering with their productivity. And then I really like the Jeff Patton videos. If any of you got the chance to watch some of his stuff, he did the user story mapping book. But this video, which is output versus outcome and impact, is fantastic. But he talks really carefully about how to look at output, which is, say, the number of tickets that you build, the number of sprints that you complete, versus the outcome, which is the impact for both you and the customer. So what are you getting in terms of the response from customers, as well as actually the ROI and market share, that sort of thing. Also think about creating experiments or features that have more variations. So if you think about horse racing, when you have sort of 7 horses in the race and you only own one of them, then you've got a 1 in 7 chance of winning. If you put 5 horses into the race that you own, then you've got a much higher probability of winning. And this is kind of what this is trying to say on the right, which is people who did experiments that had 3 variations or more generally had a higher win rate, possibly because they'd introduced more variations that could win. And also that there was probably more nuance to the hypotheses that were being tested there. But definitely trying to do slightly more complicated experiments, it also saves you a bit on build effort and production cost. So if you're building an experiment anyway, why not put 3 variations in? Because it's only like maybe an extra morning of development time to do a slightly varied version of that experiment. But actually you've got an extra hypothesis that you were able to take into your experiment. Then finally, actually thinking about how a varied strategy with lots of strategic tracks can actually lead to wins in the long term, even if certain projects are ones that you feel like you have to abandon earlier on. So having a mixed roadmap with lots of different types and sizes of ideas, some are on different strategic tracks trying to achieve different things. And this is an example on the right of different features that were built by Apple that later on led to them being able to deploy the iPhone. And some of them were projects that never came to life and weren't useful or were not successful. And then finally, having a think about the value of your ideas at the same time as the velocity of your product delivery or program. So thinking about how you can boost the value at the same time as your velocity. Prioritization myth number 3. A prioritization framework will save me. So the misconception here is that the perfect prioritization framework exists. And unfortunately, it just doesn't. Using a prioritization framework for all decisions is a bit unmanageable, particularly if you've got those incredibly large numbers of ideas all in a Google Sheet, hundreds of ideas. And the thing is, building features and deploying experiments, doing tests, it's iterative and it will change your worldview every time new results come in. So my advice is to use the prioritization process when appropriate. Use it to help you pivot away from changes which produce little impact on the customer. When you ideate, pre-qualify ideas using a confidence scale, and I'll come on to that in 1 second. Disregard ideas that are too small or don't have enough data to support them, and then use a confidence scale like the one proposed by Itamagalad. So I absolutely love this diagram. I use it with all the product teams I work with, and I try and talk people through it as frequently as possible. But it's a really nice way of getting you to think about, how do I score the amount of confidence I have in my idea? What's the amount of evidence I have? And if someone comes to you with an idea and says, oh, I've got this great idea, and you go, well, how would you score it on this scale? And they're like, oh, well, it's a 0.3, 0.03, then definitely it's not one that's worth working on. Versus if they come to you and say, well, I've got user testing evidence from lots of user interviews, then that's a 3, and that's actually a much better score. And really people should be picking ideas that have got those higher scores. So it's a nice way of helping someone to qualify their idea, helping them to think more deeply about the evidence they have for their idea. But it's a nice way of saying no as well when someone comes to you with ideas that sound a little bit like too difficult to do, or there's not enough evidence to support them. It's a really nice way of asking someone to say, well, actually, no, we can't do that. Go and find some more evidence to support your idea. And then moving on to avoiding validating for the sake of it. So this is the too long didn't read from Itamagulad's article, but never launch anything solely based on opinions. It's okay to release minor tweaks based on assessment. Having supporting data without testing is enough to launch only very small, low risk, easy to revert changes. Everything else should be validated through tests and experiments. However, there are various levels of testing to choose from with different associated costs and confidence levels. How much validation you need depends on the cost of building the idea in full, how risky it is, and your risk tolerance. So that echoes again what I was saying earlier in terms of your appetite for risk means that you can traverse this scale more easily. You can start getting lots of small, low risk things out to prove a high risk idea, for example. And then when you validate, iterate in a smarter way. This is a really nice way that Teresa Torres described the process for a team building and designing a bunch of features. On the left-hand side, you can see she was talking about a product manager and a designer talking to each other. And the product manager said, look, we've got to get the first iteration out, but we are only relaunching A as part of the MVP. And then the designer went away and released the whole design, everything that was A and B that built on A, and C that built on A, and D that built on A, gave her the entire design, and then only A was launched as part of the MVP, and then off the back of the MVP, B, C, and D had to be redesigned. And then when she went into iteration 3, A and B were released, and then C and D had to be redesigned. And what Teresa Torres is trying to say here is try and follow a little bit closer to the process on the right, which is design and test your MVP, and kind of, for a little bit at least, ignore that wider design system. Don't worry about the fact that this has to fit into a broader design system that's got to work for the whole site. It does, but you should allow that design system to evolve too as you learn more information and you roll out each area of your site. Obviously, this is kind of theoretical, but I think it's a nice way of getting people to think about, don't worry about a feature that's 17 releases away. Worry about the design system for the current set of features and maybe next release, but don't worry about absolutely everything having to fit together into a really big holistic design. But I think if you read the article, she kind of has sympathy with both the designer and the product manager in this scenario. So it's not like a one-sided conversation. It's very much a two-sided conversation. So I've kind of run through steps 1 to 5 here. And then step 6 is about incorporating experiment mindset into your delivery process or doing EDD. So what is EDD? And this is quite a quick section, but I'll just introduce the concepts. So experiment-driven development is a hypothesis-driven approach to software development. Like TDD and BDD, its purpose is to improve the way we deliver software and features using Agile. It's a conceptual framework and it helps us to approach building features in a more data-driven way. And here's a diagram on the right here from the RubyConf where this was sort of first talked about, where it was like an engineer trying to explain how EDD would work to other engineers, essentially. And it's not new. So there's some recent articles from the Sama Tech blog, a really, really great book by a guy called Paul Risson, who was working at Springer at the time and now works at Reach. I definitely recommend getting that book. So he talks about experiment-driven product development. A really interesting EDD framework for Ruby called Vanity that was released by Asaf Arkin in 2010. And then this engineering article from 1994 by a woman called Esfliger, and design and analysis and software engineering. She literally talks about the process of designing engineering experiments, how you can literally implement A/B tests through engineering. And it's a very, very old article, but actually it proves that the concept has been around for a really long time. And it helps us with multiple problems across the software and product lifecycle. So do customers want this new feature? Do they still use this old feature we want to get rid of? Are the things we build genuinely impactful and doing good for the business? Should this product still exist? Should it be sunset? Should something else take its place? And it really helps us to bridge that discovery validation gap, avoiding a waste producing machine, discovering our problem, customers' problems is not enough. You've got to go beyond just discovering, and validating that solution that we're implementing is the correct one. So what are the benefits? So for engineers, it's compatible with other frameworks and it's completely compatible with Agile. You create features with minimum coding effort to put something out there in order to validate it. You don't have to over-engineer for all the just-in-case scenarios. You'll come to them later. If in 6 months the market changes and you need to dump features you no longer need, you can be grateful you didn't overdevelop them. You can remove features or add features using EDD, go quickly in either direction. If you think a feature or an area of the product is bloated, test removing features. And there is a small caveat though. To make all that happen, your code has to be easy to change, and it has to be easy to troubleshoot, and it has to be reliable enough to continuously deploy. If you have a release pipeline where you have to take your whole site down and release overnight, then you're not going to be able to do EDD as easily. You'll still be able to do some experiments, but you'll have to find a different way of doing it. This very much relies on your ability to have experimentation built into your delivery and release process. So how can you implement EDD? EDD in its simplest form, you create a hypothesis, you design an experiment, you deploy and run your experiment, you do your analysis and reporting, and you run with your best option. And then particularly EDD is focused on number 3, where you're actually trying to deploy your code in a way that allows you to experiment on it and actually release continuously in experiments. So how do you enable EDD in your business? Obviously, you've got a framework, but that's not enough. You've got to enable it in your business. And every business, its core sort of theory or core thing it wants to do is to be successful. And in order to do that, all the teams have their goals need to be impacted, and the team needs to be successful and healthy. And you do this by enabling experimentation in 6 different places. So one is through technology, one is through skills and training, one is having good data analysis, another is through having good ideation and discovery, another is through your experiment design process, and then finally, how do you execute your ideas? How do you design them, build them, and then actually test, release, and launch them? And so I've got a little bit more detail here, but essentially, if you don't have a good A/B testing tool, you don't have a good release process, then your technology is kind of failing you. If you don't have skills in your company that allow you to know how to do testing in the first place, then that's an area where you might be missing out. Ideation and analysis go together hand in hand. You need someone who's good at data analysis, as well as someone who's good at finding customer problems, holistically looking through data, prioritizing and looking at the confidence and ideas that you're developing. Experiment design is very much statistical, kind of how do you shape an experiment so that the metrics and segments and the exclusions, the variables that you're including, even the type of experiment that you're running is correct. And then finally in execution, it really boils down to your process, your workflow, getting through your ideas within your sprint, but also I'll flag there, handling your risk and technical debt. So you always need to have a plan for that within experimentation, because experiments accrue more technical debt than just releasing, because you're kind of doing 2 versions of something in a single feature release. So here's the session synopsis. I won't bother to read this one, but it just gives people an idea of what the overview.
Hi, this is Rommel Santiago from Experiment Nation. If you'd like to connect with hundreds of experimenters from around the world, consider joining our Slack channel. You can find the link in the description.